All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Laurence Piper. I'm editor-in-chief of Theoria, a journal of social and political theory. And welcome to our third live stream event, and the first time that we are doing a live stream on one of our special issues. The special issue in question is issue 181 on the politics of recognition, that was edited under the leadership of Dr. Chris Allsobrook, who is the director of the Senate, and others.
And Abraham Olivier.
Oh, my apologies. And Abraham Olivier. So my job is really just to welcome you all and to hand over to Dr. Allsobrook, who will now chair the rest of the session. So welcome, and over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Laurence. Thanks, and welcome everyone to today's live stream seminar. My name is Chris Allsobrook. I'm the director of the Center for Leadership Ethics in Africa at the University of Fort Hare, where I work also with Abraham Olivier, who co-edited this special issue. So today we're going to be discussing the topic of normative ambivalence in critical theories of recognition, and the role of critical theories of recognition for the diagnosis of conflict and oppression. That was the topic of the special issue. And joining us today are Abraham Olivier, Dimpho Maponya, Olerato Mogomotsi, and Jane Gordon, and Pedro Tabensky, and Andrea Hurst. So we'll be talking a little bit about the issue and the various contributions to this the special issue. The special issue came out at the end of 2024, and now in 2025, we're seeing an abrupt halt all of a sudden to 3 decades of rapid globalization, liberal democratic free trade consensus coming to a collapse with the fracturing of post-Cold War order. And it seems the encounter between the self and other, relations of recognition, misrecognition, and relations of power have played a central role in philosophical understanding of agency and identity in politics and ethics. So that's some of the contexts that we came together for this topic. So for a long time, the concept of recognition has played a central role in phenomenology, also in critical theory, and a strongly normative role, for instance, in Axel Honneth's work. So a number of papers in this special issue deny any special normative significance to recognition. For instance, Andrea Hurst argues quite strongly that love is stimulated by misrecognition and by surprise, and not the stifling sameness of recognition. And Olerato and Pedro have both denied any special normative status to the relations of recognition. Olerato looks at Hegel's classic formulation. Pedro considers Fanon on recognition in revolutionary Algeria. So really the question then is, if recognition holds no intrinsic secure normative or critical traction, and relations of recognition are ambivalent, normatively ambivalent, then at this time of serious crisis, global crisis, of pronounced misrecognition, inhumanity between different political, cultural, ethnic groups, religious groups, so what critical role can the concept of recognition play in the diagnosis of conflict and oppression? So we're going to start first with Prof. Abraham Olivier, the co-editor with me of this special issue. Abraham is a professor of philosophy at the University of Fort Hare. He's leading research on African phenomenology, and he's long been engaged in research on the phenomenology of pain in philosophy of mind, in animal ethics, African philosophy. Might call him Professor Payne, like our Vice Chancellor at Fort Hare, Prof. Bushungu. So Abraham, could you perhaps tell us what considerations or concerns prompted this set of reflections on recognition in the issue, and how that informed your contribution, which considers the recognition of animal pain?
Yes, thank you, Chris and Laurence, everyone. So mostly, as in this special issue of Theoria, which we co-edited, philosophers deal with recognition or misrecognition between humans and not between human and non-human animals. And my contribution is an attempt to address this gap. I'm doing this by focusing on the problem of recognition of non-human animals, and specifically the recognition of the pain-related suffering humans cause non-human animals. So animal pain, so I think we all know, is mostly caused by domestic use. For example, massive intensive farming worldwide reflects disregard of the pain and suffering humans cause animals. And this calls for the recognition of animal pain and suffering. My focus is going to be on pain-related suffering, that's not in suffering in general. The aim is going to be to argue for recognition in the phenomenological sense of giving adequate regard to pain experience in animals and the capacity to express it in their own specific, species-specific terms. That's quite important, in a way that will motivate us to prevent it. So I'm going to say a little bit about that. Just note the contemporary discussion, as you will know, holds largely a narrow understanding of recognition in terms of mutual recognition, and most it is between humans, as I indicated. And some call for a wide understanding of recognition in terms of adequate regard. Accordingly, the value or a valuable feature of any entity is affirmed, regardless of whether they are aware of such affirmation. This allows for animals to be objects of recognition, even if they are not themselves considered subjects of recognition. I'm going to advocate and advocated in the published paper a wide understanding of recognition that allows for animals not only to be passive objects of recognition, but subjects held in adequate regard as capable of expressing, in their own terms, the pain they suffer. There are good reasons to do this kind of study, I think, to further answer your question. The first is there's very little research or recognition of expression of pain in animals. So I think the studies on recognition and also on the expression of pain, this is, I think, a novel contribution, or it fills some of the gap. And then the recognition of animal pain, I think that's the most important point, acts as a moral and political motivation for us to change our ways to cause them suffering. So let me say a little bit about pain experience in animals. Pain is generally associated with physical hurt and suffering, with mental agony. Pain-related suffering is typically viewed as acute or ongoing pain that becomes an enduring burden without the prospect of relief. I concentrate more specifically on physical pain rather than other forms of pain-related suffering. Physical pain itself is typically distinguished from psychological pain, such as grief, or social pain, such as political atrocities. Biopsychosocial models prevail in pain discussions today, and these models assign biological, psychological, and social dimensions to physical pain. So generally, it is accepted that the capacity to feel physical pain is shared widely across animal species, from the bottom to the top, if you want to put it that way. Academic debates commonly focus on comparisons between human and animal pain. The main assumption in this paper is that a comparative approach may be in part helpful, but remains insufficient. For this reason, I take a phenomenological approach, with the assumption that it is not firstly important what pain animals experience, but that they experience pain. Now, the most widely accepted definition by Zimmerman of animal pain assigns to pain experience in animals several connected components, which are pretty much the same as we have in the main definitions of human pain. Firstly, pain is associated with actual or potential injuries. This requires the capacity of nociception, and many species qualify for this requirement. In addition to mammals, this includes, for instance, fish, crustaceans, as well as insects and mollusks. They all feel pain. Secondly, pain is associated with a sensory and aversive experience caused by an injury. This is what we typically would call subjective pain. An example is the avoidance or preference learning. And thirdly, pain is associated with an evaluative motivational component, which causes protective and vegetative reactions. Now, this together with aversive reactions is experimentally demonstrated even in what are considered less complex animals such as crabs. And then finally, pain is associated with modified species-specific social behavior. So all of that animals have in common. Thus, animal pain is a complex subjective experience with multiple biopsychosocial dimensions, including a sensory and affective state with negative valence that elicits motivational behavior. Well, in the final instance, the precautionary principle is often invoked, and this is what I would also do, the benefit of the doubt. The common pain definition is sufficient to recognize that animals have the capacity to suffer pain, even though we know relatively little about what their suffering exactly means. If we know that little, it doesn't mean they don't have pain. We should, supply or commit the fallacy of ignorance. Let me say just a little bit about the expression of pain in animals. I argued for the need to remain open to taking seriously how animals exactly may express pain in their very own species-specific terms. And this can be in species-specific linguistic terms or not in linguistic terms at all. I use the concept expression to refer to what concerns or matters or is significant to animals, and in this sense, what meaning pain has for them. These expressions, like I indicated, can be linguistic or non-linguistic. Neville Gregory offers a very helpful list of linguistic and non-linguistic expressions of pain in animals. Non-linguistic expressions might include, for instance, escape reactions, abnormal posture, gait or speed, guarding behavior, etc. And there's a long, long list, which I don't have time to repeat here. And then there are linguistic expressions of pain, which might include vocal forms of communication, for instance, vocalizing, groaning, whimpering, crying, squealing, screaming, groaning, etc. Also a long list. The point here is that there is good reason to ascribe expressions of pain even to animals which are regarded lowest in complexity on the so-called evolutionary scale and least capable of sentience. Essentially, the main point here is that the goal is to recognize the animal points of view, even to imagine what it would be like to suffer pain like another animal. After all, we are animals ourselves, and they won't understand our pain. Let me say just a little bit, that I think I'll be finished within 10 minutes then, Chris, about moral action and also political action. So the recognition of expression of animal pain acts, I think, as a motivation for us to change our ways to cause them suffering. That's a further extension of recognition. In terms of moral action, I work a bit with McCormack's work, for instance, in the book, The A Human Manifesto. Consider, for instance, two applications of her ethical approach to animal rights and studies. She endorses what she considers an increasing movement from animal rights to absolute abolition and away from the master's discourse imposed on animals without the possibility of consent. McCormack's critical remarks on animal rights, as indicated, are particularly relevant to animal studies of pain. Research mainly draws from experimental settings that inflict pain and suffering on animals to assess its effects without possible consent. Recognition means at the end to call out harm caused to animals in the name of anthropocentric science. And just a few words about the challenge to politics. McCormack thinks that humans will never abstain from anthropocentrism and recognize animals in their own terms. She ends up opting for activism, embracing human depopulation towards extinction. I disagree with that. The advocacy of human extinction downright fails the recognition of those who suffered extermination or colonial violence and other forms of oppression. I rather agree with Shili Mbembe's advocacy of inclusivism in, for instance, necropolitics, and in his latest book also. Mbembe's political challenge is for politics to be radically inclusive. Such inclusive politics should afford rights, laws, legislation, and enforcement that can effectively prevent harm humans inflict both on other humans as well as on non-humans. This may sound optimistic, but it is no mission impossible. What sounds impossible is for what Mbembe calls a democracy for all, including non-humans. And I think that is quite a laudable aspiration. I'm concluding here with a quote from Derrida. We all know about the terrifying and intolerable industrial, mechanical, chemical, hormonal, and genetic violence to which man has been submitting animal life for the past 2 centuries, end of quote. With others, I call it a war on animals. Humans have always managed to stop their wars. It doesn't quite look like they will be able to this time, but I guess they will. My question is simply then to end with, why not stop the war on animals as well? Thank you.
Thanks, Abraham. That was an excellent overview of the argument that you made, and it's been good to see how the arguments developed as you progressed with these ideas. In a sense, we're trying to figure out what it's like to be a bat again, and you're showing in many ways how animals, how their pain can be recognized from our own perspective, even though it exceeds that. And there's a call to action that comes from that recognition. So thanks. We'll have questions later from people who've been listening in. But first we'll go to Olerato Mogomotsi, who's a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Cape Town. And he's working primarily in social ontology, African philosophy, epistemic justice. He's been considering how to escape the colonial library, and working very much in Western philosophy and African philosophy at the same time. So he's been looking at Heidegger and Hegel in his research on recognition, and so he's contributed a paper to this special issue on Hegel's account of recognition, where he offers a novel interpretation. Olerato, are you there? Can you maybe tell us a little bit about how you approached recognition in this paper, and what your argument is and your conclusions?
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, thanks for this opportunity as well. I think I'm coming in very skeptical of the kind of normative pretensions of Honnethian recognition. And I think, there may be a few things to say as to why I arrived to where I actually arrive at. So I'm coming at it from the perspective of someone who is a reader of later Hegel and kind of prefers the interpretations of recognition that we see in the phenomenology of spirit and the philosophy of right. I mean, I know that recognition doesn't feature as like a central theme, or like it doesn't feature explicitly in the philosophy of right, but I think there are a couple of things to be learned from that. But Honneth's interpretation of recognition should be understood in the context of earlier gender philosophy, as they call it, Hegel. I think in part has to do with, that might have to do with why there's all these normative pretensions. It's almost like, it seems like it's a moral good for an individual insofar as recognition, according to Honneth, contributes to an individual's psychological sense of self. Because remember that Honneth is also coming in from the perspective of wanting to reject certain aspects of the metaphysical picture or the metaphysical background of Hegel when he's developing his account of recognition in the Struggle for Recognition book. So I'm coming at this, I think, in two ways, wanting to obviously reject the normative pretensions, because I think quite a number of very compelling arguments have been made by the ambivalent scholars of recognition, as you would say, which I'll speak to just shortly. But also, I think there's things to be said about the value of returning to certain aspects of Hegelian metaphysics, particularly this notion of actuality in Hegelian metaphysics, in order to hopefully get a better picture of what recognition is and how it fits into the picture. So I think the concern that I would have about the Honnethian picture maybe comes from the ambivalence, the feminist critical theorists like Judith Butler. People might be familiar with all these critiques that have come out of that tradition, including the fact that, recognition is not necessarily something that's going to be good for individuals, because I think they're responding to the conception of recognition that comes out of Honneth's original conception of recognition in the Struggle for Recognition. And I'm also speaking to this question of recognition, or I have this skepticism, or rather healthy skepticism of Honneth's approach, because I realize that Honneth's approach to recognition is actually one of the most strongly, I think it has a huge foothold in current recognition debates. So people tend to make use of that conception in order to build other form of understandings of, of conflicts, as you said, or oppression and so forth. However, as we know from the ambivalence conversations, one of the issues is that recognition is something that can actually be used as a conduit to further oppress individuals. I know this might be I forgot the person now, but there was this example about how, when a child is growing up and a girl child is growing up, and there's like a ballerina. So the children, in order to show that they love the parents, in order to show that they love their child, ends up like doing everything that kind of reinforces the gender norms of the child and of being a girl, including taking the child to ballet school and so forth. And in that instance, it seems like, the child is being recognized by the parents. However, that recognition also seems to be an insidious conduit in reinforcing certain gender norms and gender ideals. So I think there's a lot of compelling arguments to look at why we should be skeptical of the normative pretensions. So outside of that, what I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to say that Honneth has this long-standing commitment to trying to save the normative significance of recognition. He does this even in response to ambivalence critiques. I mean, he developed quite recently a new kind of typology of recognition, if you want to say, where he says there's normative, there's the moral kind of recognition, and then there's the ideological kind of recognition. So he tries to do all these kind of things to make sure that he can still, argue for that. But I'm much more on the side of returning back to at least later Hegel in order to really understand what kind of role recognition plays. What is recognition? What is the point of recognition? That's really kind of where I'm coming at. And having been interested in looking at the development of self-consciousness as desire in general, people might be familiar with that claim from Hegel. looking at self-consciousness as something that is really traversing on a journey towards attaining actuality, as quite literally embodying the concept of itself, if you want to be, very quite Hegelian with that. So there's a trajectory of self-consciousness that we need to be cognizant of, and we need to place recognition in service of that trajectory. So that's why I see it important to only understand recognition in a functionalist sense, in the sense that it plays a constitutively necessary role in the attainment of actuality. But I think the issue is that that constitutively necessary role has been confused with the fact that it is, this kind of or rather this idea that because it's constitutively necessary, it also has a moral negative or moral significance. So I'm trying my best to try and, distinguish those two things, say that, yeah, it can have, it does in fact have a constitutively necessary role to self-consciousness's actuality. However, we need to realize that in understanding that function, all right, that constitutive necessity, it's very possible for it to be manipulated and used for malevolent ends under the guise that this constitutive this role is being fulfilled. So I'm effectively speaking to for example, understanding why, for example, in the case of the ballerina girl, why, almost like it becomes possible, for example, to almost interpolate individuals through through recognition, for example, because it demonstrates that people are under the impression that in being recognized, I'm being rendered actual. Right. So there's something that seems to kind of be exploited in these conferrals of recognition. Also, in the same time, desires of recognition can also be informed by this more primordial, I would say, desire for actuality. And that's why ultimately we might be so quick. I mean, even now, we might be so quick to appreciate any form of any form of recognition that we get, is because we think that there's a sense of affirming, of completing, of creating this self-certainty, this independence that we I guess we'd say we're existentially in some sense always seeking. But yeah, I think that's where my contribution comes in. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks. Thanks. I was muted there for a second. So yes, so you're in a sense skeptical of the normative conception of recognition, and go back to Hegel to see what the role of recognition is really playing, which is quite different from Honneth's programmatic approach, which is what we often find. I guess what he's responding to is always the worry in critical theory that it's a kind of dead end, very good at critique, and then no standard for assessing or diagnosing current political problems. But yes, in fact, the role of recognition can be ideological. That's one reason why I don't like living in a small town. Is that you get trapped in a certain role in the way you're recognized. And we think we're worrying about what other people think, but often it's actually really our own concerns about ourselves that we have at heart, which points out that role of recognition in actuality. So we'll get back to some of the questions that arise from that. But I think it's great that your paper really set up that issue, which a few other contributors also addressed. So Jane, thank you very much for joining us from. So thanks, Olerato. We're going to move to Jane now, who's joining us from the United States on a Wednesday morning. Jane's a professor of political science, University of Connecticut, who works in political theory, Africana political thought. She's been looking at enslavement, statelessness in recent work. And she edits with Lewis Gordon the journal Philosophy and Public Affairs. Jane, in your paper in this special issue, you consider also the ambivalent function of political recognition in building post-colonial democratic solidarity. So in many senses, the project of post-colonial state building has involved the reproduction of alien state forms in which citizens do not see their aims and interests or customary social practices recognized by the state. So could you perhaps explain for us, please, how your paper addresses this crisis of recognition in the post-colonial state, which I think many of us can identify with, and why you advocate for more plurinational, creolizing state formations?
Sure. So first, thanks so much, Chris and Abraham, for bringing us together and conceiving of this issue of the journal and for the invitation to be with you today. And so it sort of, I came at the topic a little bit more obliquely, primarily as a political theorist thinking about the nation state form as being in real crisis. And I saw the connection to the theme of recognition primarily through just thinking about how in the Euromodern world, the nation state has set the primary conditions for how relations of labor, land, and political belonging have been construed. And for a long time, the nation state has really been seen as the exclusive custodian of recognition, and also as a prime site of misrecognition and alienated forms of recognition. And so my piece was called Creolizing the State with a question mark, because I really did see it as exploring these particular kinds of possibilities. But the thinking really came very directly out of a book I'd written in 2020 that was focused specifically on statelessness and contemporary enslavement, the rise of both. And the book had really culminated in what I was trying to call an anti-statism. And I may sound very American here, and I apologize for that if that's true. But I'm in a context where there's been a sharp rise on the political left of anarchist approaches to thinking about the state. And people who see the state primarily as predatory and kleptocratic, either as unable or unwilling to counteract the kinds of precariousness that are created by current political economic developments and violently xenophobic forms of practice. And yet I thought that anti-statism is very dangerous, that we need global responses to what has made statelessness and other forms of forced labor highly lucrative, and that has to involve governments and political institutions. And I also argued sort of in a more philosophical way that a lot of anti-statism really relies on a logical circularity, where the forms of political institution that we like are not called states, and the ones that we don't like are called states. And so it becomes easy to discredit states. But I basically had said that states include their neo-fascist varieties, as we're seeing now in the US. They also include political institutions that have very imperfectly expanded human freedom. And so the question isn't really whether we're for or against states, but the kinds of political institutions that we need and how they're constructed. And so I was drawing here from two political theorists in the States. One's Alex Olson, the other's Alex Zamelin. And they basically say if democracy is intended to be enacted by the people, then the state itself is ours to reimagine and to bring into being. And so in the piece, I basically begin by talking about all of the cautions against state making that we need to be aware of. And I sort of go through them quite systematically. And then turn to Afro-Caribbean and African thinking to look at sort of kernels of different possibilities for thinking about state making. And I draw primarily from the Haitian Constitution of 1805 that was authored by Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and then from the writings of Frantz Fanon that really distinguished nationalism from national consciousness, and the ways that those really resonate with the writings of Cabral and sort of the visions of dynamic unities that he offers. And then I end and with looking at Kwame Chichea's writings about thinking about the meta-state in the context of Ghana. And some of those just sort of the specific things that I'm trying to think through with this, they really actually come out of reflections on a 1987 essay called The Madman and the Migrant that was by Jean Komaroff and John L. Komaroff. And they explain a distinction in the Tswana language between the words for work and the words for labor. And so while the connotations of neither word are frozen in time, the former word for work, which is godira, is associated with making, doing, causing to happen, as when you might cook or cultivate or create a family or perform a ritual. And it involves working for oneself in modes of active self-constitution through a creative process undertaken in and with relations to others. And its value lies precisely in producing and extending the self in ever-thickening ties of interdependence that make and remake social being. And that's contrasted with sort of the opposite word for labor in all of its alienated forms, which is bereka. And in Bereka, the whole point is that one's alienated in one's labor through the fellowship of kith and kin, and that personal forms of viability are eclipsed through the invasion of malign forces, culminating at worst in social death. And so wage labor in its alienated mode is sort of the quintessential version of that. And I was using those two terms because when many people think about the state, they associate it entirely with the latter term and positive institutions primarily with the former. And so what I was doing in looking through the Haitian model and then the post-colonial state building models was to look at the ways that sort of their efforts to thicken relationships of social dependence and multiple forms of recognition and mutuality, so that relations aren't sort of emanating from the middle downwards or outwards, but rather they're constant centripetal and centrifugal processes that are underway. And so I'll just speak very briefly about some of the more concrete instances of this and then stop. So part of the reason I think it's so useful to revisit abolitionist and anti-imperial state building theory is that I think they enact exactly what Samir Amin is calling for when he argued for delinking from hegemonic approaches to globalization. And those are precisely ones where recognition and conceptions of development and growth and all of those are really just premised on terms that serve Europe, the Euro-Americas, and maybe Japan. And everybody else is sort of engaged in a subordinate form of integration. And so what was so interesting about the 1805 Constitution of Haiti is how it conceives of state making and what a state can be. And so part of the thing that's so interesting about it is that it premises the state on an abolitionism, on the effort to recognize, first of all, through the naming of Haiti as Haiti, that racialized enslavement was introduced through genocide, and that remembering that genocide has to be central to a genuinely abolitionist form of state making. The other is that it obviously abolishes enslavement and demands equality before the law and outlaws the possibility of owning property in the form of human beings. But the part that interested me primarily, and I'm obviously not alone in this, many people have commented on it, is that the argument was that no white man could come to Haiti and acquire property, but white women of mixed children could, and former mercenary soldiers who were primarily German and Pole, who had fought for Haiti's military success, could also be citizens, but that all citizens would be designated Black, and Black citizens very specifically. But where the sort of point in my revisiting it was that the nature of membership was based on a record of political orientation, where one had contributed to the active throwing off of enslavement and the ongoing practices of enslavement. And so political recognition becomes something that's premised upon a political identity that's entirely about how one orients to the past and how one sees what can count as legitimate labor, and the relationship between labor and membership. And then in turning just briefly, I mean, jumping massively forward to Cabral and to Fanon, part of what really fascinated me in their work is that unlike so many accounts of state building where it's all about how to create the right sets of institutions so that you can bypass the necessary to build social fabric through actual relationship building, in both Fanon and Cabral, what you get centrally is this mapping of all of the multitudinous forms of difference that need to be negotiated and translate it into strengths rather than fault lines. And so they offer all kinds of accounts of how to do this. But again, what's really interesting about it is that state making is about community making and relationship making that doesn't happen once and for all. That to the extent that one's thinking about political mechanisms, they're always about how to broaden and deepen channels of communication and collective building. And so I talk about creolization in the end mainly to say that what's especially useful, I think, in these theories of thinking about how to create new forms of political belonging through state making is that they're actively trying to avoid decreolization, which is where the meaning of any kind of existing belonging, whether ethnic, whether religious, whether linguistic, that its meaning could be treated as sedimented and fixed. Because the whole point with all of these theories of state making, including Chichea, is they see it as an active project that must be constructed. And so if we can predict, say, where one will land up politically based on the ethnic group into which one was born, we failed. And so their whole point is that part of the project of post-colonial state building is making the meaning and consequences of our identity sufficiently malleable that they're not overdetermined, that what political institutions create and make available to us can't be foretold by our birth certificates. And so I can just read in close. I can just read and close. Cabral, Fanon, and Chichea had no reason to call their vision a creolizing one. Still, the political disposition and mechanisms they outline seem like highly effective ways not of prescribing creolization, but of staving off decreolizing tendencies that they had very good reason to fear. Indeed, they suggest that signs of decreolizing, whether reifying ethnicity to obtain necessary resources only for some, or empowering new mediators between the metropole and local urban centers without any attention to internal peripheries, immediately promise political failure. They rightly affirm that not to attend to the state is gravely dangerous. It is to leave what remains the single most consequential organ of political life to those devoid of concern with decimating the planet and its peoples. In other words, when we ask whose state, our answers cannot let the most impoverished and corrupt instantiations exhaust our answers. And I'm happy to talk more, but I'll stop there.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Jane. That's a great insight into the concerns that you had when you were writing this paper. So here in South Africa, there's been, of course, a serious loss of confidence in the state and loss of participation. And we very much inherited a state in 1994 that was created between 1900 and 1910. So there's been calls for a new social compact, and also we have a constitution that sort of freezes that negotiated compromise. So there's no ways to reinvent the state or change the state. So in a way, these reflections speak very much to concerns in South Africa. And there's also xenophobic problems in South Africa. But there's been a Pan-African legacy to the liberation movement, and very, very much in music and culture, a strong Pan-Africanism, but not so much in political form, in terms of citizenship and the state. So it's interesting to see how these alternative non-political forms of creolization might be inspirational for in politics. So we'll be discussing some of those issues later. We're first going to go to Pedro Tabensky, who's the director of the Alan Gray Center for Leadership Ethics at Rhodes, that focuses on helping students reason ethically to change their patterns of behavior in their lives. He's written on happiness and judging, understanding, on evil, higher education transformation, and now recently his book on Fanon in Algeria. So Pedro, you discuss Fanon's time in Algeria in your paper in this issue, and like Jane, you also consider the crisis of recognition that's typical of post-colonial state formation, which Fanon was concerned about in Algeria after the Civil War. It's not an uncommon phenomenon, oppressive kleptocratic dictatorship in post-colonial Africa. And much of what Fanon describes is also recognizable for many of us. So you've been thinking a long time about effective conditions for civic solidarity in a fragile post-colonial state. How do you think the relations of recognition offer any helpful theoretical framework for the diagnosis of conflict and oppression in the post-colonial state, and how it can perhaps give us ideas on how to build relations of civic solidarity that can serve as a basis for post-colonial state building?
Yeah.
Pedro?
Thanks, Chris. Great. Thanks for that intro. Good intro. Yeah, I'm also kind of, I guess you would say, optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect kind of guy. I think that Algeria's predicament during the war was tragic. And I don't think, in the book, which is about comparing Fanon and Albert Camus in Algeria, which is not what this paper is about exactly, but it is tangential and it's part of that bigger project. I kind of point that tragedy out, and I do in this paper as well. And I point out the limitations, I mean, the virtues and limitations of Fanon's thinking. The desperate situation in which he was thinking, I think it's really important that we understand that as well. So my criticism is always coming from the point of view of someone who's sympathetic and yet critical in many respects. So for Fanon, I think one way of reading Fanon, particularly his last two books, The Dying Colonialism and The Wretched of the Earth, is that he's giving us a philosophy of recognition. He's giving us the conditions required for not only for others, for the other, the colonial master, the bastard French, in this case, that were just absolutely and horribly ruthless since the colonization in 1830 of Algeria, dehumanized the population in the most savage way, as reported both by Fanon and Albert Camus, and left Algeria no alternative, Muslim Algeria, namely Berber and Arab Algeria, that's Muslim Algeria, to have no choice but to engage in a violent confrontation to eliminate, or to try to eliminate, the Manichaeism that the French regime, colonial regime, had set up. And I think that failed. And I think for reasons that Fanon, for which I'm critical of Fanon, while at the same time being sympathetic, because I don't think there was a solution in a way. But that actually, in a way, that tragedy, in a way, should also shed light on conditions for the possibility of recognition. So what happened in Algeria was people, and Fanon talks about this, maybe not using the language of recognition that often, but Muslim Algeria didn't recognize itself. It was so oppressed and crushed that there was no self-recognition. That had to be built. So in that way, I agree with Olerato's Hegelian reading. I think Fanon was inspired indeed by Hegel. It was an endpoint. Recognition was an endpoint, something to be achieved. And he offers some beautiful examples of how that can happen. I think one of the important distinctions, the case of the veil, the family, love, how it gets reconfigured in revolutionary situations. It's beautiful stuff. I think his second book, A Dying Colonialism, is radically understudied. I mean, that book is really quite beautiful. About how a society, in much more detail actually than in The Wretched, how a society can come to build itself from within itself after being completely crushed by the oppressor, and by also things like sexism and the veil. So he gives us an account of how the reconfiguration is happening through the revolutionary process. So, the woman with the veil, suddenly the veil becomes a place to conceal weapons. It becomes a place where men who are partaking of the revolution can conceal their own identities and move from place to place. It's something that women can put on and take off suddenly, because when they have to go to the European sections, and they choose, women who are more European looking, Arab women or Muslim women who are more European looking can take their veils off and dress themselves up as Europeans and do the things that they did, namely put bombs in different cafes famously. The problem, and this is a problem, and this is one reason I bring Arendt into the picture. And again, I really like Arendt, as I really like Fanon, but she's far from perfect. I mean, the sort of her views about civil rights in the United States and her frankly racist and bigoted at times. I still think there's a lot of interesting things, and I think her account of violence is deeply interesting. And her account of violence is deliberately, I think, contrary. She's having a dialectic with Fanon, and I think actually more possibly even with Sartre, the Sartre of the preface of The Wretched. And that in her basic idea is that violence can't build anything. You cannot. So for Fanon, you can build culture. You can get culture going again. So, right, kicking it off. And for him, culture is a dynamic thing. So it's growing, it's evolving, but it has an imminent force, but that force needs to be found and needs to kind of take off. And that is the medium that the French left Muslim Algeria with. It seemed, at least according to Fanon, the only medium that was left was violence, right? So people who I really like, I love the work of Moulad Faraoun in his journal, for example, of the revolution, of the war. And I really like his wrestling with what to do, because he was very down on the FLN. The FLN is the revolutionary group that Fanon was part of, but he was also incredibly down on the French. And he was on the ground, he was a school teacher on the ground in Berber, Algeria, in the country, seeing that one day the French would come in and do their thing. Next day, the FLN would come in and do its terrible thing. And he gives many examples of how of that thing. And so this is consistent with Arendt's picture of violence. So Arendt's picture of violence is violence can't build anything. Violence can clear the ground to build something else. But these are two very different things. You cannot just use violence as a building, as the catalyst to build something. It only levels the ground, clears the ground for something else, something new, a new birth, right? And I'm alluding to her conception of natality there. For Fanon, on the other hand, violence can become a creative force. So that's the kind of dialectic. And I agree with Arendt, right? But at the same time, I don't think Fanon was between a rock and a hard place. I mean, what does he do? What do you do if the French were so terrible? How can you possibly do something to stop the horror from happening? And it looked like the French only left the Algeria because liberal Muslim people and non-Muslim people like Camus, they thought that we could kind of, let's try to have a conversation here. But the problem is the French didn't see their interlocutors as genuine interlocutors. They were just garbage. So the problem was real and tragic. And another thing that Arendt points out with violence is that the violence needs to be violence can only be effective in certain very specific circumstances. You cannot let violence take on a life of its own. And that's what happened in Algeria. So I can shoot someone in self-defense. I can engage in a very calculated violent actions that have a finite end, right? Not prolonged forever. And what happened in Algeria is the violence got out of hand, and whatever justice the FLN wanted to achieve failed. And actually, in a very interesting, one of Fanon's friends, Abane Ramdane, was murdered by the FLN. And Fanon is famously quiet about that, except he tells certain friends in private, Simone de Beauvoir among them, and that's where we have records of the fact that Fanon knew that his friend had been murdered by the FLN, and people like Claude Lanzmann, who was kind of go-between, the director of Shoah, lover of de Beauvoir for a few years, etc. But also the editor of Sartre and de Beauvoir's journal. So he was a kind of mediator. He took the manuscript, The Wretched of the Earth, here and there. He went to see Fanon in Maryland when he was dying, and he spent a lot of time with Fanon. And he was quite cynical also in his biography, Lanzmann's biography. He's quite cynical about his past self and the admiration that he had for Fanon, because he saw what happened. What happened was we have the FLN dictatorship, which has been in power since 1962. And it hasn't been a nice dictatorship. It was a very murderous dictatorship. Fanon's wife committed suicide, in part in 1989, I think it was, in part because of the violence that happened in the Algerian War. Not the Algerian War of Independence, but the Algerian War, when there was pressure for the FLN to leave power. There was an election. The election, basically, people voted the FLN out. The FLN didn't accept it, and that led to a 10-year bloodletting cycle. And Josie Fanon committed suicide in that context. So this is the problem, and the question I asked: how do you construct? How can you? So there's a dilemma here. On the one hand, conversation is going to help. You can't get rid of the French in that way, and you can't build a society of solidarity where people recognize each other as equals. In that context, you engage in violence, and it gets out of hand. It takes on a life of its own. The FLN killed many more Muslims than the French, I think, actually. And so, how do you, in internecine battles, paranoid attempts to rid the FLN of spies, etc., etc. So how do you, and then the revenge killings of the Harkis, who were Muslims fighting on the side of the French after the war. And the numbers are unclear, but it was many. The French abandoned them to their fate. So and the question, I continually ask this question. It's a question that I leave the paper with in a way. I kind of throw it. It's inconclusive. How do we end up? How can we construct a society where we can genuinely recognize each other in context where power imbalances are extreme, dehumanization by those in power is extreme, and they seem to leave you only with one alternative, which is not which will end up undermining it, almost certainly undermining its own justice promoting aims, recognition promoting aims. So Lanzmann describes it as a country of the new Algeria as a hobbled and lame country, where people are still messed up, basically, and where mission has not taken off. And I just want to read one passage from actually Saadi Yassef. Saadi Yassef was the commander of the Wilaya, the section of the FLN area that corresponded to Algiers, the capital. And he died a couple of years ago, but he wrote he was interviewed a few years ago. He's the producer of the Battle of Algiers, and the Battle of Algiers, that famous movie, was actually based on a book that he wrote. It's a wonderful movie. Now let me go to the paper. I just wanted to question. So here's, and I think this epitomizes the problem. So in Pharaon's words, at the time, if I had the money, I would have paid the French soldiers so that they would torture Algerians. Why? Because when an Algerian dies as a result of torture, he has 10 to 20 relatives who will avenge his death and join the FLN. This, to me, is really expresses the dehumanizing tendency of the violence that took over that country. And I think I'll leave it there. The violence, the violence that responded to the violence that started in 1830.
Thanks, Pedro. Thanks. Yes, I guess one way to get recognized is to kill and murder each other, but it leads to a constant back and cycle. And violence, as you say, violence can't build a state, although in many senses, there are those that argue that violence is the very precondition of a state. And in South Africa, of course, we have ongoing civil war, which isn't called something called a civil war, but it's not stopped and and spiraled out as well. Due to failures of recognition, although like violence, recognition itself is not a good or a bad. It depends what we make of it and what we make of the state. We're going to move. We actually, time is moving. So we're going to move to Dimpho. Dimpho, you've written critically on your in this article about Michel Mbembe's focus on the philosophy of resistance and the problem in African philosophy of an undue overemphasis on resistance politics. So we often hark back to the liberation movement and resistance politics, but you say that this overriding destructive masculine warrior agenda excludes the perspective of women. Dimpho Maponya is a lecturer at the University of Joburg. Her work focuses on African feminism and decolonial theory, and gender-based violence. So Dimpho, why do you consider the philosophy of resistance a predominantly masculine approach? And how do you think this marginalizes women's perspectives in African philosophy and in political theories of recognition?
Thank you very much, Chris, for the introduction, and thank you for organizing this as well. So for me, my contribution in the special issue was, in a sense, bringing together, like you rightly put, my research interests on African feminism as well as decolonization. So I was able to sort of bring these together. And I think what, in retrospect, when this paper was published and now, rereading it and looking at this, and even in leading up to, our exchange with planning for the seminar, it seems, I think, to me, it's really locating, or I would say, I think African philosophy exemplifies this normative ambivalence of recognition, where on the one hand, it seems very apt in identifying all the ills and the oppression and the marginalization as far as it comes from the external, like from the outside. And I think it lacks the self-reflective capacity to be able to reflect on its own doing of philosophy that in fact seems to perpetuate much of what it seems to be resisting against, which is the history of colonialism and the colonization of knowledge, and all of those things. And the advancing of a singular perspective. And I think that for me was really where the problem is at, to say there's been a lack of recognition of women in the advancing of African philosophy. And I think this brings up a dilemma of, I think, maybe intra-oppression at its most extreme, but maybe, if I was to sort of speak about it in the context of this paper, I would say maybe a kind of intra-marginalization that exists here, where it seems, like I was saying earlier, it's almost very quick to reflect when oppression is on its own self or its own, but it's very difficult for it to be able to reflect internally of the ways in which it's been doing, it's been advancing its own agenda. So in the paper titled Advancing the Recognition of Women in African Philosophy, I sort of set the scene by just painting a picture of the marginalization of women in philosophy more broadly, and then I speak about the marginalization of women in African philosophy, which right now I'm not going to get too much into why this is the case, but leading up to it, I think I can sort of capture this, like you were saying, Chris, under the umbrella of philosophy of resistance. And I think this is one of the reasons why African philosophy finds itself in this problem, where for the most part, it's been doing the work of deconstructing and not so much the work of reflecting, as well as constructing or maybe reconstructing, if I were to say, resulting in what Mbembe calls philosophical poverty. So it's almost like a recycling or cycling of philosophical ideas. And much of this comes from the attempt to want to prove the existence of similarities across, across contexts. So I bring together recognition, or at least I bring recognition under the framework of decolonization, and I theorize recognition, or at least I think about it as a decolonial objective. And this is if we think about decolonization more broadly and what its goals and objectives really are about. So I connect recognition and decolonization in speaking about the marginalization of women. And my argument really is that the lack of recognition of women in African philosophy is in fact incompatible with the decolonial objective, because it doesn't really help us advance the recentering of the previously marginalized if all there is to perpetuate or reform to the already existing structures. So my speaking about recognition is drawing from the work of Charles Taylor. So I speak about recognition and the struggle of identity. And I look at Charles Taylor's notion of recognition, and he simply ties recognition to identity and speaks about recognition as instrumental in constructing one's identity, where, one's identity is shaped by recognition, or it's shaped by its absence. So he speaks about recognition at two levels: the intimate level, the public level. And I think what is interesting here for me is when he speaks about recognition at the public level and speaking about it as a duty that one has to others. So there's a duty that each one of us has to others by recognizing, others. So, and I think he draws recognition, identity, and speaks about the construction of an authentic self. So in order for one to be able to construct an authentic self, there's a need for recognition, which then plays a part in this construction of identity, and then as a result, the construction of one's authenticity. And he speaks about recognition at the public level really functioning at these, he breaks it apart into these two parts. And he speaks about, on the one hand, everyone deserving of equal treatment, and secondly, everyone should be recognized for their unique identity. And all of these, or at least both of these, speaking to the duty that all of us have to others. And there's an extension in the literature by Akahimo of Taylor's notion of recognition, and he speaks about recognition as something that depends on affirmation by others. And I think this is interesting because later on in the paper, I then draw from the literature on African philosophy and African conceptions of personhood. And I think there's very close similarities that can be drawn here, where if on the one hand we speak or we think of recognition as something that depends on others, I think it's similar to the ways in which African personhood has been conceptualized in African philosophy, where one's personhood relies or depends on others. And I also bring in Chris in that conversation. I mean, his work on human dignity speaks about how dignity is also something that really necessarily depends on others. So what does this mean then for lack of recognition of women? Before I speak about what it means for lack of recognition of women in particular, I do sort of speak about more generally about what lack of recognition really means, or what the consequences of lack of recognition could be. So Akahimo speaks of lack of recognition as not only a lack of human dignity or a negation of oneself. He speaks about lack of recognition as lack of due respect. I mean, he simply puts it like it's just a lack of due respect, not recognizing another person. But I think there's a much more serious implication to this lack of recognition if you look at Taylor's work. He speaks about a lack of recognition and its ability to induce self-hatred, where one can assume inferiority, which can result in a very unhealthy dependency on the other for recognition and validation. And ultimately, it creates a very disturbing relationship that one has with their environment. So now speaking to lack of recognition in the context of women and in the context of African philosophy, what does this mean? I think this really, for African philosophy, I think this goes against the fundamental goal of African philosophy if we locate African philosophy within the broader decolonial objective, which is, to eradicate colonial thinking and to recenter the previously marginalized. I mean, firstly, the lack of recognition of women results in an incomplete attempt at decolonization. And I think at the most basic level, if there's a lack of recognition of the other, that simply just goes against, the broader objective of decolonization. And secondly, the lack of recognition of women in African philosophy is also detrimental to their personhood, because if we speak about recognition as fundamentally significant to the construction of one's identity and one's personhood, as well as recognizing one's human dignity, lack of recognition is detrimental to their personhood, as it may be read in extreme cases as the denial of personhood for African women. And based on the links between recognition and identity, it seems reasonable to deduce that this lack of recognition denies women the opportunity to reconstruct their identities in a world that has persistently denied their existence. And this supposes a negative relationship between African women and the social world, one of constant frustration and suffering, and not of personal expansion. And I think, this really gives a picture, or at least ties this whole decolonial story, African philosophy, as well as a recognition. So I end off the paper. Well, I started off as a cautionary sort of attempt, because recognizing the struggles that face African philosophy as a discipline, as a discourse, also considering, the history of the discipline. And I think the reason I really speak about it more as a caution is I speak towards the end of the paper of the challenge of addressing intra-oppression. I think this is a challenge that can really, that can apply to any intra-oppression, intra-marginalization, endeavor. And I speak of the burden of silence, and I speak about the burden of silence within the context of race loyalty, drawing from the work of the Black feminist literature that speaks about just the problem or the difficulty that race loyalty brings for intra oppression, so to speak. So there's a sense in which, because oppression or because marginalization or because the lack of recognition occurs from a within perspective, there's a sense in which we try to be very, cautious and very sympathetic and very accommodating when we try and address these kinds of things. But I think really the point I was trying to make in this paper is to just say we need to be very critical about how we philosophize for, in particular, the context of African philosophy, but also very broadly to post-colonial studies and decolonial studies, to say we need to be very critical and very creative, how we conduct our work, how we philosophize, given these historical, consideration, lest we find ourselves in these very same structures. Like, I mean, when you were introducing Olerato earlier and you're saying he's battling between or trying to escape, these colonial frameworks, we need to be critical, conscious, and aware, and practice this reflexivity at any given point. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dimpho. That's fascinating. In fact, there's more. What you've described is in fact coming. It seems you've developed your thoughts since this paper further,
Yes.
And this gives us a good insight into where you're coming from. Yeah, African philosophies, of course, there's a strong affinity with Taylor and African philosophy of personhood and Ubuntu, and in a sense, then it's strongly normative. I suppose recognition is not intrinsically normative, but it is so from our relations with each other. And this makes women especially vulnerable to the politics of recognition. So in fact, it has a strong normative role. But Andrea, I'm going to just move on to Andrea for the who will be talking last in this session. She's denied the normative status of recognition in her paper. She's written about love and relations of intimacy, which is also what Colby Dickinson wrote about also in this special issue. Andrea is a Saatchi chair at NMU. And Andrea, you advocate a healthy ethic of non-recognition in love in this article. And you extend this to political obligations of civic solidarity. So what do you think that why do you argue that non-recognition is preferable to the politics of recognition and this agonism of contestation? Yeah.
Thanks. I don't, and not exactly, and
yeah.
all of those qualifications.
Thanks. Maybe you could tell us more than about your paper. Thanks.
Yeah. In a way, that this paper does speak fairly directly to the question that you posed in the beginning. So the idea that sort of underpins it is this idea that it's actually unrealistic to expect recognition theories to give us a sound normative basis for diagnosing social injustices. I think this expectation just does not correspond with the inherent unavoidable complexity of the philosophical concepts we rely on to understand ethical life. So it's time to give it up. The time is long overdue for that, I think. And by now, kind of learning from thinkers like Derrida, we really should humbly acknowledge that ethical life is shaped by ambivalence. There just is no single normative perspective to rely on as a basis for ethical diagnosis and action. And the best we can do is kind of remain ethically active, caught up in this ongoing negotiation of best possible compromises for now, and then constant flexible adjustment to the changes and new injustices that are brought about by these very compromises. Because that's a basic idea that underpins this paper. It actually is also about Charles Taylor and his politics of recognition. And what I argued is that Charles Taylor makes the same point in his article on the politics of recognition, where he discusses the two main normative versions of the politics of recognition. Both of these aim to challenge kind of structural inequalities and bind us into an integrated community through this idea, this philosophical idea of equal reciprocal recognition of all for all. Now, that I've called the, or philosophy's ideology of eros. And remember, eros is that binding force in the universe. And if it could reach its ultimate aim, it would bind everything into one unified whole. But ironically, of course, divisive conflict is baked into this idea. On the one hand, the idea of equal reciprocal recognition stresses universal sameness. The idea that we all deserve the same rights because we are fundamentally alike. And on the other hand, equal reciprocal recognition emphasizes what makes us unique, our cultural identities, histories, and perspectives. And in true Derridian style, Taylor shows that both versions of the normative politics of recognition are aporetic, they're dead ends. They not only oppose one another, but each is internally inconsistent, since putting it into practice contravenes its own core principle. This is what he shows in his article. So ironically, treating everyone the same can actually reinforce inequality, and you end up having to treat people differently for the sake of equality, for the sake of sameness. And on the other hand, in the politics of difference, it tries to preserve cultural uniqueness, but often ends up enforcing conformity within those cultures. So trying to protect uniqueness in the whole undermines uniqueness in the parts. And so the problem that you find then is that while both of these opposing kind of basic approaches have some legitimacy, proponents of one, rightly assured of its kind of limited legitimacy, assume that this automatically delegitimizes the other. And you have these kind of separate conflicts of normative theories of recognition. But Taylor argues that instead of one disqualifying the other in a kind of a power struggle, we actually just need to live with the tensions they expose. And he proposes a hybrid approach, a kind of political juggling act where we commit to defending certain rights while also according the immunities and the liberties needed to create space for cultural particularity. And he acknowledges, along with Derrida, this is hard work. It's really imperfect. It doesn't work well, but it's the best we can do. So I like Taylor's analysis very much. What I thought, which is where the love comes in, is that you also need to factor in some kind of affirmative account of non-recognition. I mean, the idea for this came from his remark that the idea that we are formed by recognition creates misrecognition as a harm. And I thought, well, hang on a moment. Lacan and others have made it clear that there are affirmative forms of misrecognition, kind of recognition of the unrecognizable in us or our non-identity to ourselves. So Lacan would argue that contrary to this ideology of eros, love happens in the domain of misrecognition. And I thought that this perspective could not take away from and not subsume, but just deepen the discussion of politics of recognition. Lacan would argue that, or does argue that, recognition as identification identification being the very act of trying to see people precisely as they are, that kind of recognition is already an act of misrecognition, because it has to fail to capture the ineffable complexity of a person. So even if identification remains the starting point for any political move, if we acknowledge the unjust misidentification in every act of identification, then we can't just blindly and arrogantly support a political system based on a particular way of identifying humans. So also this idea of bringing misrecognition into it suggests that we should let go of the idea that full recognition is necessary for dignity and respect. Instead, we might kind of ground our political moves not in seeing one another, but in a kind of humility that comes from knowing we'll never fully comprehend or represent each other. And also, if we see that we're drawn to what is ungraspable in others, that's where desire is triggered. We're drawn to quirks and strange and singular qualities that make us feel disconcerted, not to people's credentials. If we accept that, then we kind of move away from competitive models of recognition. So just to make it absolutely clear, I'm not at all advocating some kind of new radical politics of misrecognition that will solve all the political aporias that Taylor describes, not at all. I do think acknowledging misrecognition as affirmative could catalyze a kind of an ethical shift from competitive power struggles to kind of mutual empowerment and humility and generosity and creativity. And I think this would create an ethical attitude towards others that would augment the kind of difficult political juggling that Taylor rightly calls for. Of that kind of ongoing, judicious, and inherently imperfect negotiation between conflicting political imperatives of recognizing both sameness and difference. So I'm not denying that that is what one has to do. You have to negotiate those two imperatives. They are normative. They're not going to work well. But I think that an attitude of non-competitive mutual empowerment and humility and generosity would augment that struggle. So that's really all I'm arguing. I don't think it's quite as radical as you might have suggested initially, Chris. But yeah, that's it.
No, sure. Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, in a sense, I guess that also speaks to Abraham's point at the beginning, which was about that recognizing animals' pain. We're not going to recognize exactly how they experience things, and yet the basis of animals' rights shouldn't be on what we see, what we can identify with. It should also exceed that. And so in a sense that applies to our relations with animals and also with each other in the state. There shouldn't be this insistence on sameness or a certain idea of who the citizen is. I didn't quite realize that this would take up all of our time. That there's not going to be time for discussion and questions. There have been some questions in the chat to which our participants have been responding at the same time. But we have basically run out of time. This has given an overview of some of the contributions to this paper, and I appreciate those who came along today to give us an overview of their papers and how it fits together in this issue. It's been actually fascinating to hear what everyone has to say and how these papers fit together. And in fact, I've just seen text when Abraham and I were putting together this this issue, and to hear everyone talking about their papers has given a very different insight into that. So I appreciate that. I'd encourage anyone who was here today to look at the special issue and the various papers in that issue in light of what they've heard today. I assume that the participants who are here today would be happy to engage with you further if you were to contact them. So thank you, everyone. We're going to be stopping now since it's 6:30. It's dark outside here. I see Abraham's face started off from well lit to a glow in the dark room. Thanks very much, Abraham and Pedro, Dimpho, Olerato, and Andrea and Jane. And thanks to Sharon and Laurence from Theoria who organized this today. It's been a good experience, and thanks very much.
Thank you all very much. We're going to
Thank you very
close the
much.
meeting now. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Great.
Good evening. It was great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Great, yes.
Thank you, everyone. Organizers, please.
Thank you. Bye.